If you look at the scandals, if you look at Robodebt, if you look at what's happening with climate policies and the most egregious behaviour by the senior executive, it's because they are furiously trying to retrofit policy to fit a political mandate. And I think a lot of that would fall away if the government just started having policies that were in the public interest. I mean, that's a novel idea.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains politics, policy and economics in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. The country is still reeling from the far-reaching effects of the coalition government's debt collection scheme, Robodebt. As the recent Royal Commission into Robodebt showed, there are a few events that really illustrate the harm that can be inflicted by policy and governance failures and the subsequent attempts to cover them up. But was Robodebt an anomaly, or are we still vulnerable to the powers of the executive government in Australia, despite the Albanese government's commitments to accountability and integrity in our public agencies?
The Royal Commission into the Robodebt scandal, which unlawfully raised debts of at least $1.7 billion.
It destroyed and cost lives. Innocent people were hunted, hounded by Centrelink for money they didn't owe.
Abuse of power.
The basis of income averaging.
Nearly 500,000 people.
The Royal Commission has handed down its report recommending its architects be referred for criminal and civil prosecution.
There's no doubt that the illegal Robodebt scheme was a shameful chapter in public administration in Australia.
The gross betrayal and a human tragedy.
Previous government and senior public servants gaslighted the nation and its citizens for 4.5 years.
The Australian Public Service is meant to be a pillar of our country's democracy, efficient and accountable in its delivery of services, frank and fearless in its advice to elected officials. But it's fair to say the APS hasn't exactly been cloaked in glory for some time now. Driven by what Royal Commission head Catherine Holmes described as venality, incompetence and cowardice, the Robodebt scandal undermined trust in the public service.
Look, to put it bluntly, this is about as lame an advice as you could get, isn't it? As a legal advice, it's really unconvincing. It's like a child putting its hands over its eyes and thinking you can't see it.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced the inquiry to ensure that a similar failure can never, ever happen again. But in a recent piece in The Monthly, our guest today says that the same behaviours that enabled Robodebt have been playing out for decades in our climate policy making, and questions whether the government has appetite to implement its proposed integrity reforms. Polly Hemming is the Director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program and author of An Executive Summary, a recent piece in The Monthly arguing that the true test of government's credibility on democratic integrity is in its approach to the climate and biodiversity crisis. She's with me today to explain. G'day, Polly.
G'day, Eb. How you going?
Good, thanks. So in your piece, which was a cracking read in, I think, the previous issue of The Monthly, you compare the Australian Public Service performance on Robodebt and climate change. Can you explain why you drew that comparison?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not a comparison I draw lightly. It's not, I'm not casually throwing around, analogies about Robodebt. I'm really trying to point out that the Australian government's approach to climate change is just as serious as Robodebt, and people are going to die as a result. The science on climate change has been clear for decades. We know what causes it, burning fossil fuels. We know not doing anything about it is going to kill people. We know exacerbating it is going to kill even more people. And, those words by the Robodebt Royal Commissioner, venality, incompetence and cowardice, they can equally be used to describe the way the government and the senior public service in Australia are handling the climate crisis or not handling it. The Black Summer bushfires in Australia are unequivocally linked to climate change. They killed around 500 people, 3 billion animals. Floods are killing people. Extreme heat causes more deaths than any other natural hazard. Air pollution is killing people. Climate change is killing people in Australia and abroad, and it's going to get a lot worse.
It's been labelled the worst fire season ever recorded, an apocalypse, a nightmare, and like looking into the gates of hell.
During the Black Summer bushfires, flames 20 metres high, fanned by 100 km/h winds, all part of a tragedy that claimed 7 lives.
2 men believed to be a father and son were killed trying to defend their...
One fire captain wrote in his statement, "I heard what sounded like a freight train. The sky filled with fire."
Yeah, you talking about the Black Summer bushfires there really does bring it home about what happens if we don't really tackle climate change properly. And there has been this massive gap, I guess, between what the science shows and what public policy demands of us. So Robodebt was an illegal scheme that was allowed to really wreak havoc on people's lives, and it revealed extraordinary behaviour by a specific element of the public service, the senior executive. So what is the senior executive for those who haven't worked in the public service, or for people who haven't lived in Canberra for the past 20 years like me?
Unless you are a public servant, you're right. The distinction between the SES, which stands for Senior Executive Service, and the rest of the public service is not terribly meaningful. But if you are a public servant yourself, it's very significant. And the SES are the individuals appointed by ministers who are essentially the intermediaries between portfolio ministers and public servants who are implementing the policies and programs in their department. They are the leadership of government agencies, of government departments. The SES are paid enormous amounts of money, and if you've ever watched Senate estimates or read anything about the public service, they have kind of fairly confusing names. They're called secretaries, deputy secretaries, first assistant secretaries, division heads and branch heads. And they're basically, if you compare them to, say, the private sector, they are the executives of the public service.
And so why do you distinguish between the SES, the senior executive, and the broader public service? What is their role in policy making?
Well, they increasingly have they shouldn't, but they increasingly have a very political role. And I distinguish between them because it's the SES who were implicated in Robodebt. They're the ones calling the shots. They're the ones, someone once described it as a master and servant relationship between ministers and the public service. They're the ones basically implementing what ministers dictate. So if you think about other high-profile scandals in Australia beyond Robodebt, there was a recent inquiry into the now disgraced Home Affairs boss, Mike Pizzullo, which found he breached the Public Service Code of Conduct multiple times. He was SES. They are quite distinct from the broader public service, the lower levels. They're paid differently, their roles are different, and they're the ones that you see involved in these scandals, and the government itself has acknowledged, that there's a fairly uncomfortable relationship between senior executive and ministers.
So the kinds of public servants that you would see appearing before estimates, for example, that's kind of the layer of the public service that we're talking about. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. That top level intermediary, and they're the ones that field those questions and answer them and essentially set the strategic direction of departments.
And so in her first report on the progress of reforms last year, the Minister for the Public Service, Senator Katie Gallagher, pointed to the creation of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, something the Australia Institute has backed for a long time, and a number of other measures that the government has put in place to reverse decades of kind of institutional decay. But is it the case that the government's efforts on integrity and accountability are just going to it's going to take quite a bit of time to change what has seemingly become a pretty rotten situation? Or is there a real gap here between the kind of the commitment that we hear about to change and what the government is actually doing to change things?
I think in fairness, or to give credit where it's due, the Albanese government responded very quickly to Robodebt. Prime Minister Albanese gave very grave assurances that his government is very different to the coalition in its approach to the public service, and these public sector reforms that the government is proposing are just kind of part of a broader suite of reforms that the government has introduced. We've got things like the National Anti-Corruption Commission. So I think there has been an acknowledgement of the problematic role of the SES. Public Service Minister Katie Gallagher herself said the public service has become more like an administrative service to ministers in a speech.
What did she mean by that? That they're not giving kind of frank and fearless advice? They're just kind of...
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly it. They are basically doing the bidding of ministers. And I think on another occasion she said that the public service must be empowered to be honest and truly independent and deliver advice that the government of the day might not want to hear just as loudly as the advice that we do.
We've made the expectations of senior executives in the APS clearer and stronger. We announced the intention to include behaviours as well as outcomes in SES performance reviews, with a framework recently signed off by secretaries. This framework will ensure that our most senior APS leaders serve by example. They will lead by strengthening the behaviour in their respective agencies. We know that good culture driven from the top delivers better results, better outcomes for government and ultimately optimal outcomes for Australians. Leadership matters in the APS.
So that all sounds really great, but what is unclear is whether these proposed reforms will be implemented at all, or whether they'll get to the root cause of the cultural and structural issues amongst the public service executive that are so prevalent. And to be honest, it really seems unlikely that the government has strong appetite to credibly implement the things it's proposing, because, to be honest, the SES, many of them previous coalition appointments, have been really useful in, for want of a better term, running a protection racket for some of the government's most controversial policies. So many of Labor's policies have been based on the coalitions, the stage 3 tax cuts in their initial form, the safeguard mechanism, the nature repair market, Australia's carbon offset scheme. This government is just as committed to gas expansion. So it really stands to reason to have the same executives in place picking up where they left off prior to the 2022 election. And this is really what my essay tries to get to the heart of, is that the administration and the implementation of Australia's climate and environment policies is really the true test for the government's appetite for genuine public sector reform and ensuring integrity in our agencies and across our democracies broadly, but ensuring the integrity of our senior public servants.
And so, Polly, if that's the true test of the government's commitment on this, can you tell us how you think the Albanese government is going? Is it passing or failing that test? And how can the government close that gap and demonstrate that they are fully committed to rebuilding a robust public service?
Well, the federal government alone, this is not all Australian governments, but the federal government provides around $9 billion in fossil fuel subsidies every year. A single gas export hub in the NT is being given $1.5 billion by the Albanese government. Documents released to the Senate show that Labor's sea dumping bill was effectively a favour to Santos. The government has refused to rule out native forest logging, and the Albanese government is still pursuing enormous gas expansion.
So they're failing the test.
So they're failing the test, I think it's fair to say. They're failing the test, and if you watch Senate estimates, and I recommend that people do, or if you go to the FOI disclosure logs on any of the department's websites, particularly climate and environment, you see that nothing has changed. The senior executive is still running political lines. They're saying that we are reducing emissions as fast as possible. You look at an FOI and there's a senior executive instructing people how to downplay the emissions from a Woodside gas field.
Which is not the role of the public service at all. Like Woodside's, it's a pretty powerful company in and of itself. It doesn't need senior public servants coming in to defend its emissions.
Doing its PR for it.
We are on track to meet our 2025 and 2030 emissions reduction targets of 15% and 30% respectively, towards an aspiration of net zero by 2050 or sooner.
Why can't you be more ambitious about this? Why can't you pick the most ambitious pathways as the right way for the company to go forward?
I actually we'll differ on that, David, because I think we're ambitious. Thank you.
So, Polly, you've talked about, that they're failing the test, that these senior public servants are essentially very political creatures, and that's quite distinct from the rest of the Australian public service. And that essentially we've got these people that have been in place for a long time, some of the same people as under the coalition government, which isn't necessarily a problem if they are giving frank and fearless advice. But as you've pointed out, they're playing this role in particular in climate policy. So I'll bring you back again to where we started, which is Robodebt and drawing that comparison with climate change when it comes to senior public servants and the role they play in policy making in Australia. Why is it important that our senior public servants are giving frank and fearless advice to the government? What is at stake here when it comes to climate policy?
Everything. I honestly think it's fair to say isn't this the future of humanity, really? I know that sounds like hyperbole, but we feel the impacts of climate change here in Australia, but this is literally life and death for communities in the Pacific. Australia is the world's third largest fossil fuel exporter. We are exporting climate change that is affecting people's lives, including our own, as we saw with the Black Summer bushfires. And to be clear, this is not a new thing. This is a decades-long systemic, I was going to say failure, but it's not a failure. It's been quite deliberate. There has been a number of media investigations, freedom of information documents, leaks that show that Australian governments, politicians and senior public servants have been watering down UN climate agreements. They've run interference, they've promoted fossil fuels, they've established misleading emissions accounting systems, they've twisted logic into completely unrecognisable forms, they've run scare campaigns. So this is not a new thing. But you can't say that people involved now don't know what they're involved in. The science is so clear that everyone in politics and in government now knows exactly what they're doing. And just because we don't have laws that other countries do, like the right to a healthy environment or laws around ecocide, doesn't make what is happening right. It doesn't necessarily make it illegal, although there are elements of that which I won't go into. But there is a really strong moral case to be made here. And public servants, whether they are the broader public service or whether they are senior executives and agency heads or board members of public agencies, they are held to the same public service code of conduct and public service values, which mean that the advice you give must be based on the best available evidence and must be ethical.
And I know you said it was hyperbole, but anyone who lived through the Black Summer bushfires, or I'm sure who lives in a community who has been impacted by floods or extreme heat or other kinds of extreme weather impacted by climate change, those at the time always feel like pretty life and death situations, as you said, Polly.
Yeah, it's very real. And people dying from heat alone is only going to increase. You look at areas of Sydney and it's very real for those people right now, and give it a couple of years, it's only going to get hotter. So it is life and death.
Current pledges and policies are shutting the door on our chance to limit global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, let alone meet the 1.5 degree goal. We are in a life or death struggle for our own safety today and our survival tomorrow. It is time for a game-changing, quantum-level compromise between developed and emerging economies.
So, Polly, what needs to happen now?
Well, I think what would be really nice is if the government itself just started acting in the public interest. You know, if you look at the scandals, if you look at Robodebt, if you look at what's happening with climate policies and the most egregious behaviour by the senior executive, it's because they are furiously trying to retrofit policy to fit a political mandate. And I think a lot of that would fall away if the government just started having policies that were in the public interest. I mean, that's a novel idea, but...
What a novel concept, Polly.
Yeah, let's give it a crack. Just see what happens, guys. Let's blue sky thinking here. There are already a number of existing mechanisms that should hold the senior executive to account, like even in the current state. And I won't go back to how we got here in the first place, but we have a very corporatised, privatised public service, but there still are mechanisms that senior public servants are giving the best advice. And is this kind of an ironic quote here, but the former Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Peter Shergold, once said that frank and fearless advice is a function of character, not tenure. So it shouldn't really matter, you know, whether you're on contract, you know, what the structural limitations of your job are. If you have strength of character, you would be giving frank and fearless advice. But the public service values and the code of conduct, they're unequivocal, and so is existing legislation when it comes to integrity, such as managing and declaring conflicts of interest, although the public doesn't have access to those. But there are also other transparency and accountability reforms beyond cutting that kind of Gordian knot with the senior executive that would go a long way to ensuring that the public service was giving frank and fearless advice, you know, actually facilitating freedom of information requests, potentially shortening the amount of time that cabinet in confidence documents are revealed, having adequate whistleblower protections. All those things would help bring integrity to the public service, but it would also put the senior executive on notice that whatever they were doing is potentially going to come under scrutiny and be seen by Australians.
Thanks, Polly.
Thanks very much, Eb.
This episode was recorded on Wednesday, the 6th of March 2024, and things may have changed since recording. In 2024, the Australia Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary as Australia's leading think tank. If you enjoy Follow the Money and the Australia Institute's research, please consider becoming a regular giver from as little as $10 a month at australiainstitute.org.au. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today, and you can reach out to us via email with your feedback at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. Our producer is Jennifer Macy with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.